people intuit and commonsensically understand that as a system of violent control over human beings, slavery required the use of violence to control people. And so for the entire period going back to the mid-1600s and to the early 1700s, colony after colony from New York and Massachusetts to South Carolina and Virginia passed a series of black codes or Negro Acts, various laws that were designed to empower everyday white citizens with the responsibility and, let me be clear, the duty to serve in an official capacity, to surveil, monitor, to track, and when caught, to dispense corporal punishment against enslaved African people in the colonies. It was the largest bureaucracy dedicated to a form of policing that we recognize today. And it was everywhere in the colonies. By the time the nation was born in 1790, while there were gradual abolition laws that took root in many northern colonies, the antebellum experience of free blacks was little different. What went from a slave patrol became the responsibility of a growing cohort of modern police officers. And this problem from slavery to freedom simply changed uniform and changed the instruments and tools of keeping track of people of African descent, and it expanded in the United States of America. But there's another part of this history that I think is really important, and that is that policing in the broadest sense was always about policing the essential workers of this society. And this is true in societies and countries all over the globe. And what do I mean by essential workers? Meaning the people who are at the bottom of the society, their freedom has always been constrained by more privileged and more elite, and in this country, whites. Now, whites, of course, range in class. And so one of the ironies is that both poor whites in many parts of the country were policed, especially when they challenged political authority, when they challenged economic inequality. But at the same time, they were able to join police forces. By the 1840s and 1850s, we see Irish Americans beginning to both make their way in America, but also begin to join the police force. They direct their sense of belonging in the United States for policing. Both a reflection of a racial and class hierarchy, and also a way of giving power to groups that feel like they don't have access to the top of the American economy. So policing is a reflection of a tremendous disorder in our economic system. It is a reflection of racial hierarchies that are deeply entrenched in our society. And when we see FOP or union leaders represented by working class white men, partly they have been empowered to define the profession as their own, not as a reflection of liberal democratic norms and universal ideas, but it is their profession. So for me, to talk about the history of policing is also to talk about the history of white supremacy and racial capitalism in the United States of America.
That I'm wondering, because this does not only affect, although it has largely affected the African American community, but it's also been, this method of using law enforcement and policing as a method of domination has also been used with other people of color, specifically Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans. In 1862, President Lincoln ordered the hanging of 38 Dakota warriors who had gone to war against the U.S. in the midst of the Civil War, and they were hanged as criminals and as murderers, not as enemy combatants. And I'm thinking of the Texas Rangers, who were largely created to control and dominate Mexicans who were called bandits because they were defending their land. And even with Puerto Ricans, from Albizu Campos to Oscar Lopez Rivera, all the freedom fighters were always branded as criminals and dealt with as criminals within the justice system. I'm wondering, this whole issue of the territorial expansion of the country necessitating even more police repression on these populations of color. Your sense of it in your historical studies.
Listen, Juan, I mean, the summaries and examples you just gave are incredibly important because to take it back to the very beginning, my colleague, Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who's written about the U.S. Border Patrol and its origins in policing the movement of Mexicans coming to the country because the country wanted them here to work. But she also describes that the infrastructure of American colonial settlement, the very basis upon which the country literally expanded, as you say, the territorial expansion, was the jail. And she goes back to the very beginning in the 1700s to what is now the city of Los Angeles, which used to be the Tonga Basin, which used to be populated by indigenous populations. And she said it was precisely the introduction of the physical jail as the instrument of control and domination, but a domination that was always rooted in harnessing the labor power of people, not to exterminate or to exclude them altogether, but to ensure that their labor would be extracted for the purposes of work, and then everything else would be controlled, that their freedom would be constrained. And that story is the story of every group in every part of the country whose labor power was the most important contribution that they would make. Their civil liberties, their civil rights, their human rights, their humanity itself was optional, was secondary. Their right to political dissent was secondary. So you could look at Chinese immigrants in San Francisco in the 1880s and see the same story. You can look in Chicago in the midst of the labor upheavals of the 1890s with foreign-born immigrant whites demanding fair treatment in the workplace and see the same story. You can look at Texas and look and see the story of the Texas Rangers, which enforced literal white property theft of Tejano and Mexican descendant landowners, people who not only had once been part of Mexico before the Mexican Revolution and before the annexation of Mexico by the United States in 1848, but people who were law-abiding, respectable citizens in their communities. And white settlers showed up and essentially accused them of false crimes, criminalized them, and Texas Rangers enforced that. So across time, across space, and across groups, policing has a tortured history of being enforcers of various forms of domination.